Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Susan Schoenian. I'm the sheep and goat specialist for University of Maryland Extension. I have an office at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center. It's about 80 miles north of College Park. How long it takes to get there depends how much traffic there is. We're a 500-acre research farm. We're also the headquarters for Extension in the Western region. We have various specialists at our office. We also have administrators at our office, and we also have farm crew at our office. I do research there with small ruminants. Predominantly we'll have meat goats that'll come in early June till about early October, and we actually have a performance test. They'll all be intact male goats, and we'll test them for their performance. We're hoping the coming years to be able to actually do some similar work with sheep, but right now we're just able to accommodate the meat goats. So today's topic, we're going to zero in on nutrition of the ewe and also her lambs. And as I mentioned earlier, this is actually a picture from a couple of years ago from a Katahdin ewe with a set of crossbred lambs at College Park. I'm going to start talking about nutrition at the beginning, when they're being bred. And what's very common in the sheep industry, and will work to the same degree in the meat goat industry, we do what's called flushing. It's a term that's unique to the sheep and goat industry, and what it means is we start supplementing the ewes a few weeks before we put the rams in and during the first several weeks of the breeding season. The point of this is to get them actively gaining weight. And what research has shown is that this flushing may increase lambing percentage by increasing the number of eggs that the female ovulates. It's going to be most effective early in the breeding season, but may also have an effect on improving embryo survival as the breeding season continues. Where it's especially going to be effective is on thin females, thin ones. Typically, we body condition score sheep using a range of scores from 1 to 5, with 1 being emaciated, 3 being kind of average, and 5 being obese. So we're looking at ewes that are below average primarily to get an effect on flushing. If the ewes are already in good body condition, 3s and 4s, you're probably not going to get much effect in flushing, probably none at all. It's still a good idea to put them on better nutrition at the breeding season, but you're probably not going to get any benefit by feeding grain or anything like that. Mature females are known to respond better to flushing than to yearlings or to ewe lambs. And specifically what we mean by flushing is usually we mean feeding them some grain. A little bit of grain every day, about a half a pound to a pound. A lot of times it's just straight grain like corn or barley, not necessarily a pelleted or textured sheep feed. How much you give them is going to depend on the body size of the sheep, because sheep can vary considerably in how much they weigh. We have breeds that weigh less than 100 pounds. We have breeds that weigh over 100 pounds. And you wouldn't start by giving them a half a pound of grain. You'd start more like a quarter of a pound, because anytime you feed grain, you need to give the rumen time to adjust. You can also accomplish much of the same thing by moving them to a better quality pasture, because a better quality pasture with more grass is going to also increase their nutrient intake. Now, the one thing not related to flushing but related to breeding and feeding in pastures is you want to keep ewes off of pastures that have a lot of legumes in them, like alfalfa or red clover. Legumes contain a lot of phytoestrogens, and this can interfere with their estrus cycle. It's not like they're never going to get pregnant, but it will delay it. And pastures that have some legumes in them, less than 50%, aren't going to be a problem, but you just wouldn't want to turn them out on a lush red clover or alfalfa pasture, because you're going to interfere with breeding. After the females are bred, the next part of, we kind of divide their pregnancy into 3 parts, or 2 parts really. In the early to middle part of their gestation, the first 30 to 90 days of pregnancy, what's happening here primarily is placental development, and this is very important because if the nutrition is inadequate, the placenta doesn't develop as it should, and we could have problems later on. It's not that they need a lot of extra feed, but we don't want to give them insufficient feed. Underfeeding, as you can see in this slide, 21 days of severe underfeeding or 80 days of moderate underfeeding can affect placentas. So we don't want to overfeed or underfeed. We just want to feed what they need. And actually, during this period of time, it's only a little above their maintenance requirements. We want to aim to have these sheep in the body condition score of 3 to 3.5 when they lamb. Now, there's going to be some extremes sometimes because some ewes keep their flesh really well. It might be a little above 3.5, and some, no matter what you do, seem to be below 3. But for the most part, we want to have as many ewes as we can between that 3 and 3.5 body condition score, which is, again, it's basically just average plus. I'm going to talk about body condition score at the end, if I have time at the end of today's presentations. But again, this time in early to mid-gestation is the nutrition's just a little bit above maintenance, but we don't want to under or overfeed. Depending on when lambing is due, this period of time could be out on pasture. I know in my flock the ewes will all still be on pasture, and they'll get plenty of what they need off of pasture. If it occurs at a time when there's no pasture, then obviously we're typically feeding hay. During this time, there's really no reason to feed grain unless the hay is really bad or you don't have enough of it. Because really all they need during this period of time is just a decent grass hay. A decent grass hay. They don't need any grain during this period. The most important time is actually the last 4 to 6 weeks of gestation. In fact, if I could say what's the most important time of the year a person is raising sheep and they need to do the right thing from a management nutritional standpoint, it's going to be late pregnancy. Because mistakes at this time can cause a horrendous lambing season. It can have a lot of effects on lambing, a lot of problems. So proper feeding and management during this time are essential. And there's multiple reasons for that. 70% of the fetal growth is occurring during this last third of pregnancy. The babies are really draining the ewe. They really need a lot of nutrition to grow. The ew's mammary or udder system is developing. At the same time this is happening, her rumen capacity is decreasing. So her ability to eat a larger quantity of forage is diminishing, because between the displacement with all the babies, particularly if she's carrying multiple births, her rumen capacity is decreasing. During this last third of pregnancy, extra nutrition is needed to support the fetal growth, to support the mammary tissue development, to prevent 2 very important diseases. One is called pregnancy toxemia or ketosis, and the other is called milk fever. Pregnancy toxemia is a result of the ewe not getting enough energy to support that fetal growth. It's basically an energy deficiency. It's most common in ewes at the extreme ends, the thin ewes, but also the fat ewes. Most common with ewes carrying multiple births. A lot of different things can contribute to it, but basically it's an insufficient intake of energy. The fat ewe, she breaks down the fat off of her back. They convert into toxic ketone bodies. This can be very fatal. Milk fever is a calcium deficiency. The other key thing about that nutrition during late pregnancy is its effect on birth weight. Unlike cattle, which we have a lot of influence on breed and sire and things like that, because these are litter-bearing animals, nutrition during this last part of pregnancy will have a big impact on birth weight. And lambs that are at either end of the spectrum, real small lambs and real big lambs, have a much lower chance of survival. In fact, this #1 factor that affects lamb survival, and this is particularly important in really large farms, is birth weight. So we want nutrition to ensure that we get healthy babies of a moderate birth weight. And what that birth weight is actually is, again, going to depend on the the breed and the size of the sheep. Again, we have small breeds, we have big breeds. On campus, you have Katahdins, which are, for the most part, a medium-sized breed. And so appropriate-sized babies are going to vary by that. But when you start getting a lot of big babies, you get a lot of lambing problems. Even if they're delivered okay, they're just not as vigorous as the medium-sized babies. And it's obvious why small babies can be a problem. Very often they're weaker and have more trouble competing and things like that. During this latter part of pregnancy, energy is required in the largest quantity. In fact, whenever you're feeding livestock, energy is the key. It's what they need in the largest quantity, pretty much like us. Thus, it's the nutrient most likely to be deficient in their ration. Contrary to what a lot of people think, protein requirements are not significantly higher during late pregnancy, significantly higher above maintenance, maybe just a percentage point or a half a percentage point. They're not really that much higher. Calcium requirements go up significantly during late pregnancy. And again, that factors into milk fever if we don't adequately meet that. It also is believed that calcium has a role in a lot of other things and a lot of other problems that we may encounter at lambing. It's believed that they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily have milk fever, but they have a lower level of calcium. And so a lot of things that we treat when we have a ewe with difficulty during pregnancy or after pregnancy is we very often treat them with calcium. It's a very key nutrient during pregnancy and lactation. Selenium and vitamin E are also very crucial nutrients that we have to consider during late pregnancy. How much we feed the sheep, again, gets back to that size of the ewe. Obviously, you're going to feed a 100-pound ewe much less than a 200-pound ewe. So the size or weight is very important. The age of the ewe, with the primary split being on that yearling versus the ewes that are mature. The young ewes, say breeding a 7-month-old ewe so that she lambs on her, basically on her first birthday, she is still growing. In addition to carrying lambs, she's still growing, so she needs to be fed not only for that late gestation higher requirements, but also growth. So ideally we keep them separate because they have different needs. And then the other big influence is the number of babies that they're carrying. A ewe carrying a single has significantly different requirements than one carrying twins, than one carrying triplets. For a small flock, this is what's real challenging because you don't know. Increasingly, big flocks will scan the ewes. If they've got a lot of variety in their ewe flock, it's an intensively managed flock. If they scan them, they can separate them into groups for feeding. For a small flock, we're not likely to do that. Hopefully, you don't have a lot of variation. I find that with Katahdins, you have very few single births, so you can pretty comfortably be feeding them all from multiple births. Usually during this period of time, it's necessary to feed some grain, because she can't physically eat enough forage, whether it's dry hay or lush spring pasture. She physically can't eat enough to meet her nutrient requirements. It's one thing to not meet her requirements for maximum production when she's lactating. The lambs will just grow slower. But if you fail to meet requirements during late pregnancy, you can have all sorts of problems. So this isn't a time to say, hey, I don't want to feed grain, or I don't want maximum production. You need to give her what she needs during this latter part of pregnancy. Everything is based on forage. They're a ruminant. We design their feeding program around forage. Again, whether it's dry forage like hay, we can feed silage or haylage, or if they're on pasture. We look at that quality of forage that we have, and then we supplement based on that. So again, in late pregnancy, she can't get enough of her energy requirements out of forage, so that's where grain comes into play. If the forage that she is eating is low quality, we may need to supplement protein, and we may need to supplement calcium. Give you a perfect example, if sheep are eating a grass hay, even a decent grass hay, orchard grass hay, and then the energy supplement that you give them is corn, that diet would have no problem meeting her energy requirements and even her protein requirements. Where it'll fall short is calcium, because corn is very low in calcium, higher in phosphorus. Grass hays are better, but they're still not enough. So you would either need to feed a mixed hay or supplement some calcium into the grain diet. It's real important that we don't underfeed during late pregnancy, and that includes the fat ones. If a ewe is fat, now is not the time to put her on a diet. You have to do that reduce her body condition at other times, not at this crucial time in late pregnancy. And again, she's prone to pregnancy toxemia if she's not getting her nutrient requirements. When we don't give them enough to eat, again, pregnancy toxemia, very common problem in sheep, especially when they're underfed. And a lot of times it happens, a producer's not doing anything differently, but forage quality varies from one year to the next. And you can have different factors that you don't think are happening, but they really are. Again, inadequate nutrition is going to result in smaller, weaker lambs, higher lamb mortality. You can affect both the quality and quantity of colostrum. You can affect the subsequent milk production. And you're even going to affect fiber production, because the offspring are going to have fewer secondary follicles, which are important to wool production as they mature into adults. So many, many implications of poor nutrition. I look at the picture of this ewe over here, and you know, she's going to get her lambs raised and everything, but without even touching her, I can see where she's kind of sunken, and she's not really in the kind of body condition that she could be. And then you add on top of that, she's obviously lambing in a cold environment, and she'll raise those lambs, but you're not going to expect very good performance out of them, because clearly the nutritional needs aren't being met. The lambs are on the small side, so this is just kind of my example of not meeting those needs. Now let's look at the other spectrum, and that's not overfeeding ewes. And again, this also includes the thin ones. If you want more body condition on a ewe, late pregnancy is not the time to do it. You need to feed her for her needs, but you don't need to try to get more body condition on her, because that extra nutrition is going to go into those lambs. Again, overfeeding, the fat ewes being more prone to pregnancy toxemia. Fat ewes tend to experience more lambing difficulties, and this goes back to not only late gestation feeding, but also earlier, just plain having a lot of body condition on her. They're more likely to prolapse, particularly their vagina. Think about it. A ewe's got 2 or 3 lambs inside of her. She's got a rumen full of forage, and then she's got a lot of internal fat. Sometimes something's got to give. Something's got to give, and we can have problems with prolapses. As I already mentioned, you're going to get larger fetuses, and they can be difficult to be born. And even when they're born okay, they can have a higher mortality. It just not makes sense. We don't want fat females. And then even from an economic standpoint, if it's a commercial producer, it's expensive to put fat on. It's much more expensive to put fat on than it is to just feed them to meet their requirements. So being fat can have many different implications. And again, sometimes it's hard in a flock not to have one or two that are more prone to putting body condition on, and vice versa. But we want the majority of them to be in the right condition. And if the majority of them are fat, there's something that we're not doing right. In addition to feeding the right things and the right amount of feed, how we manage feeding is also important. We want to make sure they have enough feeder space so that everyone can eat at once, and really some room to spare, because sometimes you get some dominating ewes that kind of want more than their fair share of feeder space. Particularly true with goats, not as bad with sheep, but make sure they can all eat at one time. Manage the yearlings. And again, these would be like ewe lambs that are bred to lamb as a yearling. Manage them separately. Already mentioned that they have higher nutritional requirements because they're still growing. But think about it. They're smaller. They tend to be more timid. They're going to have more trouble competing. So you want to make sure that you manage them separately. Very crucial. In fact, I tell people, if you want to breed ewe lambs, but you're not willing to separate them, don't breed them. Don't breed them. You don't want to feed on the ground like you see in that picture in the lower right corner. A lot of feed wastage here. The only exception to possibly feeding on the ground is if you're in a climate where it's really cold and the ground is frozen and they're going to eat everything up. But for the most part, don't feed on the ground. And obviously they need plenty of clean, fresh, ice-free water. Their water requirements are significantly higher in late pregnancy than they are during mid-pregnancy. And a lot of times late pregnancy is occurring this time of the year when it's cold. And so there should be heaters on the waters. Again, it should be ice-free water. If it's cold, really cold, icy water, they're going to have to spend energy to warm that water to their body temperature, so the nutritional requirements are going to be higher. If it's cold, they're not going to drink as much. So there's just multiple reasons why you really need to make sure that they have clean, fresh, ice-free water. Sometimes during late pregnancy it makes sense to include some feed additives in the ration during late pregnancy. The one that I highly recommend, either in the feed itself or in the free choice mineral, is a coccidiostat. A coccidiostat will reduce the number of coccidia oocytes that will be in the lambing environment. Because remember, when a lamb is born, he doesn't have parasites. And our goal isn't to keep him parasite-free forever. He needs to be exposed to low levels of parasites so that he will develop immunity. And of course, coccidia is one of the major parasites affecting lambs. So by feeding a coccidiostat to the ewes during late pregnancy, they're just basically the source of contamination. They're immune to, for the most part, to coccidiosis. And so by giving them a coccidiostat, we create an environment in which the lamb will be born, he will be exposed to coccidia, but at a low level. Coccidia is controlled with these three products you see on the screen: Bovatec, Rumensin, and Decox. They are actually allowed under natural standards. They're not really traditional antibiotics, even though they narrowly classify them as such. They don't have human health uses. Which product you use depends on whether it's sheep or goats. Bovatec is approved for sheep, and Decox is also approved for sheep. The other advantage of the coccidiostats is they may help to prevent abortions caused by toxoplasmosis, which is the coccidia organism that affects the cat. As you see in the box there, these products can be toxic to the equine family. This is particularly true of Rumensin, which is actually not approved for sheep and typically not fed to them. But the others, I don't think I'd be too keen to allow equines to have access to either, even though they don't specifically say it on the label. One of the problems we actually have with sheep and goat feeds is sometimes we can't get a feed mill to put these products in feed because of the concern about horses, because they're using the same equipment to make horse feed. The other thing you can add to the mineral mix or feed is antibiotics to prevent abortions. Typical sheep producer wouldn't do this. It's not a typical practice. But if you're in a situation where abortions caused by Vibrio, which is Campylobacter, or chlamydia, which is enzootic abortions, those are the two most common causes of abortion is in sheep. If you're at risk for that or they've been diagnosed, it makes a lot of sense to feed these antibiotics. Otherwise, it's not a common practice. The other thing you need to make sure is that the mineral mix contains adequate selenium. And it's best to force feed minerals, meaning that the mineral mix ideally is in the feed itself. Free choice minerals are another way to provide minerals, but there's no guarantee they're going to get what they need. So ideally it's in the grain mix itself. The two common problems that we have in late pregnancy with ewes, and we already talked a little bit about those. The ewe that you see in the picture is typically what they'd look like. In fact, this was one of my ewes from years ago. Pregnancy toxemia, again, ketosis, it's called lambing paralysis, twin lamb disease. In the UK, they call it sleeping sickness. Again, it's basically an inadequate intake of energy during late pregnancy. Very common when grain's not fed or when forage quality is very low. You can have all the forage out there in the world for them to eat, but they can't eat enough of low quality forage to meet their needs. They break down, excuse me, they break down the fat. The fat produces toxic ketone bodies. The first symptom of a ewe with pregnancy toxemia, she'll kind of lag behind. She'll go away from the main flock. She won't eat. Eventually, she'll go down. She'll become recumbent. If you do nothing, she could die along with the babies. When we catch it early enough, we basically provide glucose to her. Propylene glycol is the common product, and we can give it orally multiple times a day using an oral dosing syringe. When it gets so far along that that's not going to work, we can give an IV of glucose to get it in there quicker, or a C-section, a cesarean section, because basically the cure for this, if you can't correct the nutritional balance, is to have the babies. In fact, sometimes they'll even induce them to have the babies, again, depending how far along the symptoms are. But a C-section is the last resort, and very often it's necessary. Milk fever will present very similar symptoms. In fact, the ewe on the right, that is what she had. It's low blood calcium caused by not enough or too much calcium in the diet. In her case, it was caused by not enough calcium. I had bought some hay, sight unseen. It turned out not to be the best quality hay. I was feeding barley to meet their energy requirements, and the minerals were free choice. It appeared as if the ewes were eating plenty of free choice minerals, but obviously she wasn't. So free choice minerals work for the majority of animals, but if that's the source of the calcium, there's not a guarantee that every single ewe will get what they need. Much like pregnancy toxemia, how you treat it depends on at what point you catch it. A lot of times you can start oral. The second step is giving calcium subcutaneously, and the third step, of course, is IV. And it's amazing how quickly they will respond to it. A lot of times producers don't know which one of these problems the ewe may have. A lot of times you should be able to figure it out by kind of evaluating your nutritional program. Obviously, how they respond to treatment is one of the best indications of what they had. If this happens, it's a flock problem. You need to look at your entire program to see why this has happened. It's not that things can't randomly happen, but for the most part, things related to nutrition are an entire flock problem. Now we're going to kind of skip right on through lambing because we're talking about nutrition. We're not talking about having lambs and delivering lambs and lamb care. We're talking about feeding. So after she's had her lambs, again, plenty of nice water, clean, ice-free, fresh. I know a lot of producers who will give warm water. I find that they're really, really thirsty after lambing. This is the time when the best quality hay that you have, you feed during lactation. Could be a really good grass hay, could be a legume hay like alfalfa or clover, or it could be a mixed hay of grass and legume. You don't want to push grain on them right after they've lambed. They don't need any grain that first 24 hours. If your production system calls for grain, sometimes people do a lot with just want to have their ewes on grass. But if you feed grain, you want to do it very gradually, very slowly. Increase the grain in the ration. Feeding during lactation, it's her highest nutritional requirements during the first 6 to 8 weeks of lactation. Now, people wean their lambs at all different ages. The dairy sheep farm that I've just visited, they separate the lambs at 24 hours of age and wean them off of milk replacer at 28 days. You can wean a lamb, believe it or not, at 14 days. I'm not in favor of that, but it has been done. And then you go all the way to the other extreme of natural weaning, never actually separating them, kind of letting nature take its course. But no matter when you wean, realize that her highest nutritional requirements are during the first 6 to 8 weeks of lactation. Her milk production is going to peak at 3 to 4 weeks. So if you're going to put feed into her, this is the time to do it. It's also, from an economic standpoint, and to me this doesn't matter whether you have a hobby or you're a commercial producer, you're going to spend most of your money during this period of time. She's going to need the most feed. Her energy requirements are going to increase 30%, 55% increase in protein. So this is where this is when you need to feed protein. There's two sheep that need a lot of protein relative to the rest of them. The lactating ewe and the growing lamb. That's the only sheep that have a high protein requirement. Lactation and growth. Ideally, during lactation, she has some body reserves fat to pull from. Again, this is why we'd like to see them in a 3.5 body condition prior to lambing, so that during lactation she has something to pull from. When we don't feed, this is one thing producers don't need. If we fail to meet their energy requirements, this actually increases her protein need. So again, energy is the first limiting factor. We want to make sure first that we meet her energy requirements. It's not that we don't want to meet her protein requirements, but first is energy. It's the most limiting factor. Ideally, you want to separate ewes into different groups. Ewes with singles, twins, and triplets have significantly different nutritional needs. Again, the yearlings, especially if they're nursing twins, have higher nutritional requirements. This gets hard on a small farm. You know, you got 15 ewes, and how many different pens do you want to have? On the other hand, if people that just have a few sheep, it's easy to take one out and feed it extra. But ideally, you want to separate them. On my farm, I will separate, I'll have 3 groups. I will separate ewes with twins from ewes with triplets. I usually just have 1 or 2 sets of singles, and admittedly, they're going to get overfed. But just for a couple, I won't separate them. And then I'll have a separate group for the yearlings. I'll manage them separately. The general rule of thumb has always been to feed a pound of grain per lamb. Ideally, you balance a ration. You know, you look up the figures in the tables and all that stuff, and you balance a ration. But I can be honest with you and tell you most producers don't balance rations. They tend to feed kind of on generalities, and that's why I say 1 pound of grain per offspring is quite common. Whether that increases or decreases, again, is going to depend on the size of the ewe because of the tremendous genetic variation that we have among sheep. Of course, a lot of producers, especially nowadays, want to get away from feeding so much grain, so they'd be on pasture, and obviously that lactating female needs access to excellent quality pasture, particularly if she's got multiple births. A lot of people that try to raise sheep on grass basically don't even want triplets because it's hard to get a ewe to be able to raise a set of triplets on pasture. During lactation, it is expected that they will lose body condition and weight. That is expected. It's going to vary, and certainly if a ewe is fat at the end of lactation, chances are she's got no lamb, 1 lamb, or you can just kind of assume she's putting her feed more into her body condition than she is to milk. Again, the yearlings, that's a yearling in the, actually both of these pictures are yearlings with lambs. Keep them separate. Don't merge them with the main flock until they wean their first set of lambs. Lots of producers don't do this. Some ewe lambs are going to be okay competing with the mature ewes, but on average, I think you're asking for problems. They're smaller, they're more timid, they're still growing, they don't produce as much milk, they need to be handled differently. So let's look at the 3 potential groups you could have. A ewe with a single. She's got the lowest nutritional requirements. Pretty much almost can easily be met with just forage. I always equate a ewe with a single to a cow because that's about all it is. She's just producing 1 offspring, really doesn't require any additional feed. When you think back to probably when sheep were first evolved, they probably did just have 1 baby. That's why forage was all they ever needed. We have increased the production in our modern breeds. So we move on to twins, which is what most sheep are capable of when they're mature, which is what most producers tend to want. They produce more milk than a ewe nursing a single. Some of it's because there's 2 lambs nursing, they respond to that demand. And think of that ewe with twins. I think of the ewe with a single as a beef cow. I think of the ewe with twins as a moderately producing dairy cow. She's producing a lot of milk for those twins. Then I go down to triplets, which in my flock I'll have at least 1/3 of the flock that'll have triplets. And you could almost make a case for giving them all they want to eat, because triplets have quite a demand on them, and they need to produce a lot of milk, and they're equivalent to a high-producing dairy cow. It's very hard for you to raise triplets on pasture without supplementation. And again, that's why a lot of people who grow their lambs on grass don't want triplets. Others think we need to select those ewes that can raise triplet lambs on pasture. And we can always make selections to improve the animals to do what we want them to do. Sometimes it's necessary for that triplet ewe to limit her forage intake so that she can get enough energy. But once again, the rule of thumb is about 1 pound of grain per lamb, if that's your production system or if you're in the middle of winter. Like I said, as people move to grass, they're much less likely to feed grain. They're much less likely to have triplets out there, and they're realizing that they're not going for maximum production. They're kind of hoping to get a moderate production. Let's switch over to the lamb nutrition. Of course, colostrum is the key for the lambs. It's the first milk produced by the female. She produces it for 24 hours. The lamb can only absorb those antibiotics during the first 24 hours. It's very nutritious. It's where the lamb gets immunity. As a rule of thumb, they need about 10% of their body weight in colostrum. And they need it all within the first 24 hours. Pretty key to survival is colostrum. Lots of sources of colostrum. Obviously, the lambs that are born without any difficulty and the ewe has plenty of milk, it's a non-issue. They get the colostrum from their dam. Our goal or our job is simply to observe them to make sure they are nursing. When they have problems is sometimes where we have to intervene, not only with giving them the colostrum, but sometimes we don't have a source of it. And these are some possible sources of colostrum. Again, ideally from the dam. If not, maybe from another ewe in the flock. Very often we suggest that people, if you have a ewe that has lost her babies, if she only has a single, to milk the colostrum and freeze it so you have it available should you have a problem. You can get colostrum from another farm, but there's always potential disease risk. You can use cow colostrum. Again, there's a disease risk, particularly with yonis. It's not nearly as high in fat as ewe milk, so they're going to need more, but it's better than not having any. The colostrums that you can buy, like at a feed store or at a farm supply company, they're basically supplements. They don't have the antibodies in them. They're basically just supplements, but again, they're better than nothing. And then ewe milk replacer or lamb milk replacer, that would be what you would give after the first 24 hours. In no way does it substitute for colostrum. Feeding orphan lambs, and very often or sometimes we have to do this, again, colostrum. Lamb milk replacer, not generic milk replacers, because again, ewe milk is much higher in fat. You need to follow the directions basically on the bag. After the first few days, it's better to feed the milk cool, because this will keep them from overeating. Small numbers we tend to bottle feed. Large numbers you can feed on a more automated system. The sheep dairy that I just visited, that was a highly automated system that those lambs were nursing on. The bucket in the above picture would be more typical on our small farms. You want to offer them feed at a very young age so that they can start, so that they'll eat solid feed. And you want to wean them when they're at least 20 pounds, about 6 to 7 weeks of age. It gets pretty costly to wean them much later than that, and there's really no reason. As far as feeding the lambs, all the lambs need for the first few weeks of their life is milk. They'll start to nibble on feeds soon after birth. Again, the ewe's milk production peaks at 3 to 5 weeks. 3/4 of the milk is going to be produced in the first 8 weeks. So by the time the lambs are about 4 to 6 weeks of age, they're getting about 50% of their nutrients from something other than the milk. Whether this is hay and grain in an indoor system or pasture, they're getting their nutrients from someplace else. Creep feeding is a method that we provide additional feed to nursing lambs. We can also do this with pasture. We can give them access to better quality pasture. When lambs are born in the winter and managed very intensively and weaned early, it's very common to give them creep feed. Flocks that have a lot of multiple births, it's very common to give them creep feed. It's always more efficient to feed the lamb directly than to feed the ewe to produce more milk. If the lambs are going to go on pasture with their dams, it's much less value. Again, it's kind of a production system decision. Depends on how you choose to raise them. And it may not even be cost effective in all situations. That's something an individual producer has to look at. This just gives you an example of a creep gate, what the lambs would be able to fit through, but the moms can't. The creep system on the bottom is an outdoor system where, again, they can fit through the gate and the dams can't. When it's inside, you want it in a high traffic area. A light can kind of help attract the lambs. It should be clean and well bedded. It's kind of like the mall. It's also a place where the lambs like to hang out. And we want to do everything we can to encourage them to come in and encourage them to learn to eat. Creep feeding will help develop their rumens. You want to get it started by the time they're 1 to 2 weeks of age. You want to feed special feeds, very highly digestible feeds. When a lamb is born, his rumen is not yet functioning, so he needs highly digestible feeds. I usually feed cracked corn and soybean meal to get him started. The protein needs to be high. You should include a coccidiostat. You can include an antibiotic. Again, I don't think that's that common in small flocks. The key is keeping the feed fresh and clean and dry and not letting it run out. If it runs out and then the next day the lambs eat a whole bunch, you're asking for health problems. You want to have some water in there. You want to have some good quality hay. You want feeders that the lambs can't stand in or play in, which is challenging at times. You can creep feed on pasture. If you've good quality pasture, you may not want to feed any creep grain, but that is an option. Creep grazing is simply when you allow the access to better quality pasture for the lambs. It's been found to work and not work, because sometimes the lambs won't leave their mothers. So in some cases it's worked, some cases it's not. Weaning is, the definition of weaning is not necessarily separating them from the mother, but removing the milk diet. And as I said, it varies. Lambs have been weaned as early as 14 days, and then if you just kind of let nature take its course, 6 or 7 months of age, they'll naturally wean themselves. What's typical is between 60 and 120 days. That would be the typical. With the interest in grass operations, we're seeing more and more later weaning. It does cause stress to the lambs, separation, nutritional, and it causes stress to the ewe. It's particularly if you're weaning early. If you're weaning late, it doesn't really cause her stress. I want to hurry up in this last couple of slides to leave a little bit of chance for questions. When you wean, the lamb is of primary consideration. Leave him in the same surroundings. Leave him with the same group of animals. Leave him on the same diet. Make sure he's been vaccinated for overeating disease prior to weaning. You may treat for coccidiosis prior to weaning, or if he's on a coccidiostat. If the lambs still have, it's believed that if the lambs have access, fence line contact with their moms, that this will minimize stress. They've done that a lot with cattle. There's no data to support it on lambs, but one would think the basic idea would be the same. If you're early weaning the ewe from her lambs, you want to make sure you shut her milk production down by feeding a low protein, low energy diet prior to weaning and after weaning. Unless it's the middle of summer, it's a good idea to restrict water intake. Weaning usually is just cold turkey. We don't do it gradually. And again, if you wean naturally, you don't have to do anything special. This last section is just on body condition scoring, a really important concept in sheep. And especially if you don't actually balance the rations, you can use body condition to kind of figure out if your feeding program is proper, and you can make adjustments. As I mentioned, it's 1 through 5. 1 is emaciated, 5 is obese. You want to be kind of like that ewe in the middle picture, between 3, 3.5. You'd like your sheep always to be between 2 and 4. In fact, you may consider anyone not between 2 and 4 is not the type of sheep that you want to keep in your flock. And you do understand that it changes throughout the ewe's production cycle. She should be in really good body condition at breeding and lambing, but her condition is going to decline significantly during lactation. I wanted to leave, I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I wanted to try to leave at least a little bit. One thing that's true about sheep production, and I think all livestock production, but particularly sheep and goat, because they're not the same as pigs, which are litter bearing, but as a ruminant that's litter bearing, I think the nutrition is just absolutely key. And for most people, if they're in it for a profit, it's the twins. Question about over-supplementation of selenium as it is in some other species. There's a very narrow margin between selenium deficiency and toxicity. We have seen selenium toxicities when people use the injectable selenium products, and especially if they use they don't understand the different concentration in the different products. From a mineral standpoint and a feed standpoint, I don't know of any instances. We actually struggle with being able to get enough selenium in them because there are rules regarding selenium because of its potential impact on, I guess, wild animals. Very recently, they've discovered a source of organic selenium in wheat, and people are really excited about that one because it's going to keep selenium levels up in the sheep for a much longer period of time than the inorganic sources. So we typically grapple with not enough, but we have had problems when people have used injectables. Some people will routinely inject pregnant ewes or baby lambs with selenium. And if you have a problem with white muscle disease, which is one of the common things we get, it's like a muscular dystrophy, then indeed you need to make sure that they're getting selenium, and the feed sources may not be enough. But to routinely be giving injections is probably not necessary. But that's where I think we run into problems with the injections. The products can only be obtained by a subscription, so people should be working with their veterinarian. But that's where it usually has been a problem, is with the injectables, both in pregnant ewes, especially in pregnant ewes. But selenium's implicated in a lot of things that we can't necessarily put our finger on. White muscle disease we can clearly put our finger on as a selenium and vitamin E deficiency, but a lot of other possible effects on reproduction we can't specifically put our finger on. Same thing with calcium. We know it causes milk fever, but a lot of other things it could play a role in that we don't totally know.